I opened my marriage, got pregnant, and now my husband wants a divorce and for me to disappear. I, Amelia, want to share my story as a cautionary tale so that others can learn from my mistake. Looking back, it's easy to see how perfect everything seemed. My life felt like a dream. A loving husband, a beautiful home, and a career I was genuinely proud of. Nathan and I had built something solid together, or so I thought. He was the kind of man women admired and men respected. Steady, hard-working, dependable. When he walked into a room, people noticed, not because he demanded attention, but because he quietly exuded a confidence that drew you in. And he loved me, wholly and without hesitation. For years, that had been enough for me. I was 24 when we met. He was 28, already established in his career as a project manager for a construction firm. I remember our first date vividly. He showed up with flowers, a classic gesture that felt like a relic from another time. Over dinner, we talked about everything from favorite childhood memories to our biggest dreams. He listened, really listened, to every word I said, leaning forward slightly as if my voice was the only thing he wanted to hear. I fell fast and hard, and by the time we said goodnight, I knew he was the one. We got married a year later in a small, intimate ceremony. I wore a simple white dress, and Nathan's eyes glistened with tears as I walked down the aisle. For the first few years, life unfolded like a series of beautifully written chapters. We traveled, made plans for the future, and created a home together, a sanctuary that felt safe and full of love. Nathan had this way of making the ordinary extraordinary. He wasn't the type to shower me with grand gestures, but he'd leave me notes on the fridge, reminding me to take a break, or saying how much he missed me when he was away. He always made time for us, even when his workload piled up. There was never a moment when I doubted his love or his commitment. But perfection has a way of masking what lies beneath, doesn't it? It's not that I was unhappy. It's that I didn't realize how fragile happiness could be until it began to fray around the edges. Nathan's job started requiring him to travel more, leaving me alone in our home for weeks at a time. I told myself I could handle it. After all, I'd always been independent. But the quiet felt heavier with each passing day. I missed the sound of his laugh, the way he'd pull me close when he came home from work, smelling faintly of sawdust and fresh air. I tried to fill the void. I started volunteering more, seeing friends, and picking up new hobbies. But there was always an ache in the background, a longing I couldn't quite name. I didn't tell Nathan how I was feeling because it seemed unfair. He was working hard to build a future for us, and I didn't want to add to his stress. So I smiled during our nightly calls, asked about his day, and told him I missed him, hoping that would be enough to make the emptiness go away. It wasn't. There's something insidious about loneliness. It creeps in slowly, like water seeping through cracks you didn't even know were there. And when you're not paying attention, it fills the spaces you thought were unbreakable. I started to question everything, not just my marriage, but myself. Was I enough? Was I the kind of wife Nathan deserved? Did I still excite him, or had I become just another part of the routine? It's strange, the stories we tell ourselves when we feel adrift. I convinced myself that my longing wasn't about Nathan or our relationship, but about me. I thought maybe I needed something new to shake me out of the monotony. Something to remind me of who I was before I became Nathan's wife. I didn't realize how dangerous those thoughts were. How they'd lead me down a path I couldn't turn back from. At the time, I thought I had everything under control. I didn't see the cracks forming beneath the surface. I didn't see how my small, silent doubts would grow into something that could shatter everything Nathan and I had built together. If I had, maybe I would have done things differently. Maybe I would have fought harder to hold on to the life we had instead of letting it slip through my fingers. But hindsight is cruel like that. It gives you clarity just when it's too late to fix the mistakes you've made. It all began so innocently. Or at least, that's what I told myself at the time. It was just a night out with friends. A small distraction to fill the silence Nathan's absence left behind. My friends, Lila and Christine, had begged me to come out with them for weeks, insisting that I needed to let loose for a change. I resisted at first. A bar scene wasn't really my thing, and besides, I was a married woman. What business did I have tagging along to places filled with singles searching for fleeting thrills? But they were persistent, and eventually, I caved. That night, I stared at myself in the mirror, debating whether to even go. My reflection seemed foreign, almost like I didn't recognize the woman looking back. I wore a simple dress, nothing flashy, but for the first time in months, I put on makeup. I told myself it was for fun, nothing more. A small reminder that I could still feel like myself, that I was more than just Nathan's wife. The bar was loud, crowded, and suffocating in a way I hadn't anticipated. Lila and Christine were in their element, immediately making their way to the dance floor. But I lingered near the back, nursing a single glass of wine and people watching. For the first hour, I felt awkward and out of place, wondering why I'd even agreed to come. And then I met Lucas. He wasn't someone I noticed right away. Not in the way some people immediately draw your eye. He blended into the crowd at first. A tall man with an easy smile and a quiet confidence. We crossed paths when Christine introduced him as a friend of a friend. His handshake was warm, firm, but unassuming, and his eyes, bright, focused, seemed to read me in a way that was both unsettling and magnetic. We started talking, and before I knew it, the minutes slipped into hours. He was funny, charming, and genuinely curious about me in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. He asked about my interests, my dreams, and even noticed the little things, like how I kept adjusting my bracelet. It wasn't romantic, at least not at first. But it felt good to be seen, to be heard, and to feel like someone wanted to know who I was outside of my marriage. When the night ended, I drove Lila and Christine home, grateful for the distraction they'd provided. Lucas had asked for my number, and though I hesitated, I gave it to him. I told myself it was harmless. He knew I was married. I wasn't looking for anything more than a friendly conversation. But deep down, I think I knew better. Our texts started innocently enough. Quick exchanges about books or movies, little jokes that made me smile in the middle of my day. I told myself there was nothing wrong with it. After all, Nathan had his work trips and colleagues he bonded with. Why couldn't I have a friend? I didn't realize how blurred the lines were becoming until it was too late. The first time we met for coffee, I told myself it wasn't a date. It was just coffee, something I'd do with anyone. But the way Lucas looked at me, the way he leaned in when he spoke, made me feel a thrill I hadn't felt in years. I should have stopped there. I should have recognized the danger and walked away. But I didn't. Instead, I let myself fall into the moments. Texts that became longer, meetings that grew more frequent. I convinced myself that I could keep it platonic, that as long as I didn't cross a physical line, it wasn't cheating. I ignored the guilt that twisted in my stomach every time Nathan called and asked about my day, pretending that nothing had changed. But something had. Lucas made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in so long. It wasn't love. How could it be? But it was intoxicating. He made me forget the quiet of my house when Nathan was away. He made me forget my insecurities and the doubts I tried to bury. He made me forget myself. The night it finally happened, the night I crossed the line I could never uncross, was both inevitable and shocking. It wasn't planned, but it didn't feel like an accident on either. I found myself at his apartment after dropping Lila off from another night out. His invitation lingering in the air. "Just for a little while," he said, his voice low and persuasive. I knew better. I knew exactly what could happen. But I went anyway. And when it did, I didn't stop it. In those moments, I let myself believe it was something I needed, that it would fill the emptiness. But the second it was over, reality came crashing down. I sat on his couch, staring at the floor, unable to meet his eyes. "This can't happen again," I said, my voice barely audible. Lucas nodded, his expression unreadable, but I could see the guilt mirrored in his face. I left that night, thinking I could bury it, pretend it never happened. But secrets have a way of growing, of clawing their way to the surface no matter how hard you try to hide them. And mine was about to destroy everything. When I found out I was pregnant, it felt like the ground beneath me had given way. For days, I convinced myself it was stress causing the delay, or maybe a temporary irregularity. But deep down, I knew. I stood in the bathroom with the pregnancy test trembling in my hands, waiting for the result as if my life depended on it. Because in a way, it did. When the 2 lines appeared, it felt like the air was knocked out of me. My knees buckled, and I gripped the edge of the sink to steady myself. I stared at the tiny plastic stick, willing it to be wrong. But the truth was staring back at me, undeniable and unrelenting. This wasn't Nathan's child. I knew that with absolute certainty, and the weight of it crushed me. I spent the next few days in a haze, trying to decide what to do. Every time Nathan called, I had to force myself to sound normal, to hide the panic that was clawing at my chest. I wanted to pretend it wasn't real, that I could somehow wish it away. But I couldn't. My body was already changing, and it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. I told my mum and my sister first. I thought they would understand, that they would comfort me and help me figure out how to fix this. But when I sat them down and confessed everything, the affair, the pregnancy, the guilt, they looked at me like I was a stranger. My mum's face turned pale, and she shook her head, unable to speak. My sister, Evelyn, broke the silence with a single question. "What were you thinking?" Their disappointment cut deeper than I expected. I had always been the responsible one, the one who never made waves. To see them look at me with such disgust was almost unbearable. My mother refused to speak for several minutes, her hands trembling as she folded them in her lap. "You need to tell Nathan," she finally said, her voice cold and steady. "You owe him that much." I begged them not to make me do it. I begged them to let me find another way, any way to fix this without destroying my marriage. But they refused. "If you don't tell him," my mother said firmly, "I will." The drive home that night felt like it lasted forever. My heart pounded with every mile, and by the time I walked through the door, my legs felt like they could give out at any moment. Nathan was in the kitchen, making tea like he always did when he got home from work. He smiled when he saw me, his face lighting up the way it always did. It broke my heart. "I need to talk to you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He must have sensed the tension, because his smile faded, and he set the mug down slowly. "What's wrong?" I told him everything. Every agonizing detail spilled out of me like a flood I couldn't stop. I told him about Lucas, about the night I crossed the line, about the pregnancy test. With each word, I watched the color drain from his face. When I was done, he didn't say anything. He just stood there, staring at the floor, tears pooling in his eyes but never falling. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I'm so sorry." He didn't yell, he didn't scream. In some ways that would have been easier. Instead, he turned and walked out of the room without a word. I followed him, begging him to say something, anything, but he just went into the bathroom, closed the door, and stayed there for what felt like hours. When he finally came out, his face was calm, but his eyes were red and swollen. "I need some time," he said softly. "I can't. I just need some time." And then he packed a bag. I begged him to stay, to talk to me, to let me make it right. But he wouldn't. He looked at me one last time before walking out the door, and the look on his face will haunt me forever. It wasn't anger or hatred. It was heartbreak. I had broken the man I loved, and I knew I might never be able to fix it. For days, I called him, texted him, begged him to come home. But the only response I got was from his lawyer, informing me that Nathan was filing for divorce. As I sat alone in our empty house, surrounded by the remnants of the life we'd built together, I realized just how much I had lost. I had betrayed the one person who had loved me unconditionally, and now I was paying the price. The collapse of our marriage wasn't just the end of a relationship. It was the end of the life I thought I would have, and the beginning of a future I didn't know how to face. The first letter came from Nathan's lawyer. A neatly typed envelope slid through the mail slot, stamped with a law firm's crest. I had been waiting for something like this, but seeing it in my hands turned my legs to jelly. I opened it with trembling fingers, each word confirming the dread I'd carried since Nathan walked out the door. He wasn't just leaving me. He was cutting me out of his life entirely. Divorce proceedings had officially begun. I sank to the floor, clutching the paper, my tears falling freely. It was one thing to anticipate it, but to see it spelled out so clinically was devastating. He was seeking a dissolution of marriage, full custody of our shared assets, and, most gut-wrenching of all, he wanted me to relinquish all rights to my unborn child. Our child. The child he couldn't bring himself to claim as his own. I called his lawyer's office, desperate to plead my case. "Please," I begged the assistant on the other end. "Tell him I need to talk to Nathan. Just one conversation. Please." The assistant's polite but firm response gutted me. All communications must go through his attorney. "I'm sorry." Desperation gnawed at me. I hadn't expected him to forgive me. Not completely. But I thought there might be room for compromise, a chance to salvage something. Yet with every passing day, every unopened text, every ignored call, it became clear that Nathan had closed the door on us for good. The court hearings were surreal. Sitting across from Nathan in that cold, sterile room felt like a punishment in itself. He looked tired, his face etched with a sadness that mirrored my own. I wanted to rush to him, to shake him and scream that we could still fix this. But the sight of his lawyer sitting beside him, a wall between us, kept me rooted in my chair. My lawyer did her best to prepare me for what was coming. She warned me about the asset division, about Nathan's request for full control of the home and finances. But she wasn't prepared for what came next. During the second hearing, Nathan's lawyer presented evidence to support his claim that I was unfit to be a mother. A series of text messages and photos that suggested my carelessness during the time of my affair. They even subpoenaed Lucas, forcing him to confirm the paternity of the child. I sat there frozen as my private shame was laid bare for the court. Lucas's testimony was brief but damning. "I had no idea she was married," he said, his voice void of emotion. "I wasn't looking for anything serious. She never told me." He glanced at me once before stepping down, his indifference cutting deeper than anger ever could. Nathan never looked at me. Not once. He sat stoically, his hands folded neatly on the table, his gaze fixed on some invisible point ahead. The man I had built my life with, the man who used to hold me so tightly on cold nights, now couldn't even acknowledge my existence. The court ruled in his favor for most of our assets. The house we built together, the savings we'd carefully grown, even the car I drove, all awarded to Nathan. I was left with a small account, enough to find a modest apartment and cover a few months of expenses. But the harshest blow was the judge's decision regarding custody. Nathan wasn't interested in being a part of the child's life, but he wanted no financial responsibility either. He wanted a clean break from me, from the betrayal, from the reminders of what we'd lost. My lawyer explained the implications of this decision. "He's refusing any connection to the child," she said. "You'll need to navigate paternity rights with Lucas if you want support. But be warned, if he denies involvement, this could get messy." Messy. The word felt like an understatement for the chaos my life had become. I was left to navigate a future that felt like a maze of dead ends. I reached out to Lucas once more, hoping he might feel some obligation to the life we'd created, even unintentionally. But his response was swift and curt. "I'll pay child support if I have to, but that's it. Don't expect anything more." The final court date came quicker than I'd anticipated. Nathan and I avoided each other's eyes as the judge finalized the divorce. When it was over, I wanted to approach him one last time, to tell him I was sorry, to remind him of the love we once shared. But before I could, he slipped out of the courtroom, leaving me alone in the silence. I stepped outside into the harsh light of the afternoon, clutching the divorce decree like it was some kind of death certificate. My life, as I knew it, was over. All that was left now was to piece together the fragments and figure out how to live with the choices I had made.